Welcome back, everyone. Look, if you're gearing up for competitive exams like the UPSC, SSC, or really any state-level exams, you already know that the environmental law syllabus can feel like an absolute mountain of information. It's overwhelming, right? But don't worry, because in this comprehensive explainer, we're going to take that massive legal syllabus and transform it into a highly organized, rapid-fire revision session. My goal for us today is to help you build a solid mental framework so you can recall these exact facts instantly on test day. Okay, let's dive right into this.
To make all this super easy to digest, we're basically setting up 5 mental filing cabinets today. We'll start with pollution and the umbrella law, then move to protecting wildlife and biodiversity, governing India's forests, modern environmental governance, and finally, we'll do a quick exam recap to lock it all in.
All right, let's jump straight into our first cabinet, pollution and the umbrella law.
So, India's foundational era of environmental legislation really kicked off with a rapid-fire succession of early pollution laws. Picture this. The country is rapidly industrializing, and suddenly there's this massive, urgent need for basic controls. It all starts with the Water Act in 1974, which aimed to restore water quality and, crucially, established the vital pollution control boards. Then, just a few years later, driven by some major global conversations, we get the Air Act in 1981, which was actually later amended to even include noise pollution. And finally, the massive Environment Protection Act drops in 1986.
Now, what's genuinely fascinating and super important for your exams is the constitutional difference between those first two laws. The Water Act of 1974 was enacted under Article 252 of the Constitution, which means both the center and the state are involved in its framework. But the Air Act of 1981? That was enacted under Article 253, specifically to implement the international agreements made at the 1972 Stockholm Conference. Definitely highlight this in your notes, because examiners absolutely love testing this specific constitutional distinction.
That actually brings us to a huge question. Think about it for a second. Which is literally the most powerful environmental law in India? If you remember that 1986 date we just talked about, you might already be guessing why. This specific law was the ultimate legislative reaction to one of the darkest moments in industrial history, the tragic Bhopal gas disaster. If you guessed the Environment Protection Act of 1986, you hit the nail on the head. So the crucial point you need to remember is that this is universally known as the umbrella law. It covers the whole shebang: land, water, air, noise, coastal zones, wetlands, and even genetically modified organisms. Under this act, the central government is granted sweeping authority. We're talking the power to inspect literally any place, set incredibly strict environmental standards, and straight up close non-compliant industries. Because of this overriding power, it's also the launchpad for creating highly specific regulatory bodies, like the Central Groundwater Authority and the CAQM.
Speaking of the CAQM, or the Commission for Air Quality Management Act of 2021, this is a much more recent, modern carve-out. It was designed specifically to handle that severe, highly concentrated air quality crisis we see in the National Capital Region. What you absolutely need to remember here is its jurisdiction. It completely overrides the powers of state pollution control boards in that specific region to ensure a unified, top-down response to the smog crisis.
Okay, moving right along to our second bucket: protecting wildlife and biodiversity. The absolute heavy hitter here is the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. This is the big one that actually creates protected areas like national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. It also establishes major bodies like the National Tiger Conservation Authority and the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau. But listen up, here is a golden exam tip. Take special note of the National Board for Wildlife, or NBWL. Why? Because it is chaired directly by the Prime Minister. Also, you absolutely must memorize the 2022 amendment changes. They reduced the classification schedules from 6 down to just 4, integrated CITES provisions for international trade, and for the first time introduced the concept of invasive species. Right alongside wildlife, we've got the Biological Diversity Act of 2002, which is all about conserving biodiversity and stopping biopiracy. And this operates on a very strict 3-tier hierarchy. You have the National Biodiversity Authority at the very top, stepping down to the state biodiversity boards, and finally down to the grassroots level with the Biodiversity Management Committees, or BMCs. The highly testable fact you want to remember here is that it's the local BMCs that are legally tasked with preparing the People's Biodiversity Register. It's really just a fantastic example of grassroots environmental governance in action. That takes us right into our third section: governing India's forests. You really have 3 key legislative pillars to keep straight here. First up is the Pre-Independence Indian Forest Act of 1927. This one is all about classification. It categorizes forests into reserved, protected, and village forests, with reserved being by far the most restricted. Now, contrast that with the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, which is entirely about regulating the diversion of forest land for non-forest purposes. The key takeaway for 1980, mandatory prior approval from the central government is required. And finally, the groundbreaking Forest Rights Act of 2006. This officially recognizes the rights of forest-dwelling tribes. The absolute most important fact to lock in your memory for this one is that under the 2006 Act, the Gram Sabha is established as the main authority, granting them vital title and use rights. Now here's the catch. When forest land is diverted under that 1980 Act, compensation actually has to be paid. Enter the Compensatory Afforestation Fund Act of 2016, which is managed by CAMPA. And the financial breakdown here is brilliant for exam purposes. Funds collected are distributed with roughly 90% going directly to the states and only 10% retained by the center. Lock that 90-10 split into your mind right now. It is instantly memorable and makes for a classic multiple-choice question.
All right, let's pivot to our fourth filing cabinet, modern environmental governance.
Under the National Green Tribunal Act of 2010, India got a special fast-track court specifically just for environmental cases. It actually has jurisdiction over 7 major environmental laws, but its defining absolute best feature is its strict timeframe. Cases brought before the NGT are legally mandated to be disposed of within just 6 months.
But what if you strongly disagree with an NGT ruling? Well, that brings us to our next magic number, 90. If you need to appeal a decision made by the National Green Tribunal, that appeal has to go directly to the Supreme Court, and the absolute hard deadline to file it is exactly 90 days. So keep those two numbers firmly separated in your mind. 6 months for disposal, 90 days for an appeal.
When we shift gears to energy and disasters, there are 2 specific caveats that examiners just love to test. First, the Energy Conservation Act of 2001, which empowers the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. This was recently amended in 2022 to introduce a domestic carbon credit trading scheme, which is obviously a very hot topic for current affairs right now. Then we have the Disaster Management Act of 2005. While it covers all disasters, there's a trick here. Under this framework, it is the state government, not the center, that has the specific authority to declare a drought.
Now, the Disaster Management Act's hierarchy is actually kind of beautiful because it perfectly mirrors the political ladder of the country. At the national level, the NDMA is headed by the Prime Minister. Drop down a level, and the State Disaster Management Authority is headed by the Chief Minister. Drop down to the local level, and the District Authority is headed by the District Collector. It's just a perfectly clean, logical structure that should be incredibly easy to recall when you're under exam pressure.
Before we wrap up this governance section, we absolutely have to talk about a brand new piece of legislation. I'm talking about the SHANTI Act of 2025. This is a massive game-changing reform that officially replaces the old 1962 Atomic Energy Act. Why is it such a big deal? Because it officially allows private sector participation in India's nuclear energy sector. The Atomic Energy Regulatory Board will obviously still ensure safety, but this major pivot toward privatization makes the SHANTI Act a highly probable current affairs question for this year's exams. Keep an eye out for it.
And just like that, we're at our final section, the quick exam recap.
Let's cement this whole explainer right into your short-term memory. Let's do a rapid-fire rundown. The Environment Protection Act of 1986, that's your ultimate umbrella law. The National Green Tribunal, fast-track court covering 7 major laws with a strict 6-month disposal window. The Forest Rights Act of 2006 vests ultimate local authority right in the hands of the Gram Sabha. Constitutionally, remember, the Water Act is Article 252, while the Air Act is Article 253. And finally, the SHANTI Act is the brand new 2025 reform opening up nuclear energy to the private sector. Listen, if you know these core facts, you are going to be in incredible shape. So, you now have this completely comprehensive mental map of India's environmental laws. But as we close out today, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought that goes beyond just the exam room. As India rapidly develops, which of these legislative frameworks do you think will be most crucial in solving the environmental challenges of tomorrow? Will it be the brand new private sector innovations under the SHANTI Act, the strict centralized regional enforcement of the CAQM, or maybe the grassroots empowerment of those biodiversity management committees? Honestly, think about it, because the answer is going to literally shape the future of the nation. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Study hard, and I'll see you next time.